Most people think empathy is simply about feeling more than others. Feeling deeper, feeling faster, feeling what others refuse to feel. But what they don't understand is that raw empathy without structure is not strength. It's exposure. It's psychological permeability. And when a mind stays in that state long enough, it doesn't become enlightened, it becomes overloaded. In the early phase of the empathic experience, a person is essentially living without a filter. Every shift in tone, every micro-expression, every emotional undercurrent in a room enters their nervous system as if it belongs to them. They don't just notice emotions, they internalize them. And over time, this creates a subtle distortion. They begin to lose the boundary between what is theirs and what is not. This is where most people misunderstand empaths. They assume the struggle is simply feeling too much. But the deeper issue is identification. The empath doesn't just witness emotion, they merge with it. They unconsciously assign responsibility to themselves for emotional environments they never created. And that creates a predictable psychological loop, overfunctioning, emotional exhaustion, and a constant attempt to regulate external chaos through internal sacrifice. But in the Sophia stage, something fundamental breaks in that loop. It is not a soft awakening. It is a structural collapse of the old operating system. The mind begins to recognize a critical truth. Not every emotion detected is meant to be carried. Not every psychological signal requires engagement. Not every emotional wave deserves a response. And this realization, while simple in language, is profound in its neurological consequences. Because at the moment this shift occurs, the empath stops being a sponge and starts becoming an observer. This is what emotional sovereignty actually means. It is not detachment in the cold sense. It is precision. The ability to witness internal and external emotional states without immediate fusion. The nervous system learns a new behavior. Pause before absorption. And in that pause, something powerful emerges. Choice. Choice is the dividing line between early-stage empathy and Sophia stage awareness. Before this shift, reactions feel automatic. A person's mood changes and the empath adjusts. A conflict arises and the empath intervenes. A subtle shift in energy appears and the empath bends toward it. But once sovereignty is established, that automatic compliance breaks. Instead of emotional absorption, there is emotional categorization. Instead of fusion, there is observation. The mind begins to classify experiences. Is this mine? Is this projection? Is this manipulation? Is this unresolved pain belonging to someone else? That internal questioning becomes constant but not chaotic. It becomes structured awareness. And here is where the transformation becomes psychologically significant. Once emotion is no longer automatically owned, it loses its power to control behavior. This is the point where manipulation begins to fail, not because the world becomes kinder, but because the entry points no longer function. Emotional hooks rely on unconscious participation. They require resonance without awareness. But the Sophia stage empath develops a buffer, a perceptual space between stimulus and response. In that space, influence loses its immediacy. What used to feel overwhelming now becomes information. What used to trigger urgency now becomes analysis. What used to feel personal now becomes observable. And that shift changes everything about how a person moves through relationships, conflict, and social dynamics. But perhaps the most important change is internal. Because when a person no longer constantly absorbs external emotional noise, they finally begin to hear their own psychological signal clearly. Their intuition sharpens not because it becomes louder, but because it is no longer competing with chaos. This is the foundation of sovereignty. Not emotional numbness, not withdrawal, but clarity without contamination. And once a mind reaches that level, it cannot return to its earlier state of confusion without conscious surrender. Because seeing clearly is irreversible. You cannot unknow the difference between what you feel and what you carry. And that is where real transformation begins, not in becoming less sensitive, but in becoming precisely aware of what sensitivity is for. Because once empathy is no longer uncontrolled, it stops being a vulnerability and becomes a form of intelligence that no longer reacts but observes. And in observing, it takes control without ever needing to fight. Once emotional sovereignty is established, something even more interesting begins to happen inside the mind. The empath stops experiencing people as emotional events and starts experiencing them as behavioral systems. That might sound clinical, even detached, but it's not. It's clarity replacing confusion. Because in the earlier stage, emotional reactivity dominates perception. A person smiles and it feels safe. A person withdraws and it feels like rejection. A tone shifts and the internal state follows immediately. There is no gap between observation and interpretation. Meaning is assigned instantly, and that meaning drives reaction. This is how most human communication operates: fast, emotional, and largely unconscious. But when that automatic loop begins to break, perception slows down. And in that slowing, something powerful emerges: pattern recognition. Instead of reacting to individual moments, the mind begins to link them. One inconsistent behavior is no longer dismissed. It is stored. Two contradictory statements are no longer emotionally resolved, they are compared. A shift in energy is no longer internalized, it is tracked. The empath starts to see time as a sequence of signals rather than isolated emotional experiences. And once that shift happens, people stop being unpredictable, not because they change, but because they become legible. At this stage, the empath is no longer asking, "How does this make me feel?" That question becomes secondary. The primary question becomes, what pattern is this behavior repeating? That is a fundamentally different cognitive posture. It moves the mind out of emotional immersion and into analytical observation. And what they begin to notice is uncomfortable for most people. Human behavior is repetitive. Not random, not mysterious. Repetitive. The same emotional tactics appear across different individuals. The same avoidance patterns show up in different conversations. The same attempts to control outcomes through subtle emotional pressure repeat in different forms. Once you see this clearly, you stop taking behavior personally because you stop seeing it as unique. This is where emotional reactivity dissolves into structured intelligence. Because reactivity depends on surprise. It depends on the illusion that something is happening for the first time. But pattern recognition removes that illusion. When you have seen a dynamic enough times, it stops producing shock. It becomes predictable. And predictability removes emotional volatility. This is also where manipulation begins to lose its effectiveness in a very specific way. Manipulation relies on the absence of awareness. It depends on the target interpreting each moment as isolated rather than connected. But once connection is established, once patterns are visible, the emotional leverage disappears. A compliment is no longer just a compliment. It becomes a potential strategy. A withdrawal is no longer just distance. It becomes a data point. A sudden emotional intensity is no longer just passion. It becomes timing. And importantly, this does not make the empath paranoid. It makes them precise. There is a difference between suspicion and pattern recognition. Suspicion is emotional. It is reactive and uncertain. Pattern recognition is neutral. It does not assume intent. It observes consistency. It asks what repeats, not what is wrong. And this neutrality is what makes it powerful. Because when emotion is no longer driving interpretation, clarity becomes stable. The empath is no longer pulled into every fluctuation of social energy. They are positioned slightly outside of it, observing the structure beneath the performance. And once you begin to see structure, you stop being impressed by surface intensity. High emotion without consistency becomes noise. Calm behavior with repetition becomes signal. The mind recalibrates what matters. This is the quiet intelligence that develops in the Sophia stage. It does not announce itself. It does not argue. It does not need validation. It simply observes longer, connects deeper, and reacts less. And over time, something profound happens. People begin to reveal themselves without realizing they are being read. Not because they are exposed, but because pattern recognition removes the illusion of randomness. Their behavior unfolds exactly as it has before, and the empath no longer gets lost in it. At that point, understanding becomes effortless. Not because people are simpler, but because the observer is no longer entangled. And when you are no longer entangled, you don't chase meaning anymore. You see it forming in real time, and you stay one step ahead of it without ever needing to move. Silence is one of the most misunderstood psychological states. Most people treat it as absence of speech, absence of response, absence of engagement. But in advanced psychological awareness, silence is never empty. It is loaded. It becomes a field where information emerges that would never appear in structured conversation. In the earlier empathic stage, silence is often emotional. It can be avoidance, withdrawal, overwhelm, or even passive protection. The empath goes quiet not because they are observing, but because they are processing too much at once. In that state, silence is reactive. It is what happens when the system exceeds its capacity to respond. But in the Sophia stage, silence changes its architecture entirely. It is no longer a reaction. It becomes a position. And that difference is everything. When silence becomes intentional, it stops being a symptom and starts becoming a tool. It is no longer the absence of communication, it becomes a controlled environment for observation. In that environment, people begin to behave differently. They fill space. They project. They reveal, not because they are forced to, but because silence removes the structure they normally rely on. Most human communication is not about exchanging information. It is about managing perception. People speak to regulate how they are seen, how they are understood, and how they are emotionally positioned in relation to others. But when the empath stops participating in that regulation, when they stop immediately responding, correcting, reassuring, or engaging, the system destabilizes slightly. And in that destabilization, truth leaks out. A pause becomes a mirror. A delayed response becomes a test. A lack of emotional feedback becomes a form of pressure. Not aggressive pressure, but perceptual pressure. The other person is no longer being guided by emotional cues. They are speaking into space, and that space begins to reflect their own internal state back at them. This is where silence becomes diagnostic. Because under normal conditions, people are not fully aware of how they construct their communication. They rely on feedback loops, nods, affirmations, emotional synchronization to regulate what they are expressing. Remove that feedback loop and something interesting happens. The unconscious becomes audible. Repetition increases. Justification increases. Emotional escalation often appears where none is required. Or alternatively, withdrawal begins. None of this is engineered by the empath. It emerges naturally when the usual emotional scaffolding is removed. And the Sophia Stage empath learns to recognize this without interfering with it. This is critical. They are not using silence to control people. They are using it to stop distorting what is already happening. Because in most interactions, immediate responses contaminate data. We interrupt patterns with reassurance. We soften discomfort with explanation. We fill gaps that were actually revealing something important, but silence removes that interference. It allows behavior to complete itself. And once behavior completes itself, it becomes readable in a way that reaction never allows. This is why silence becomes powerful, not because it is aggressive, but because it is non-collusive. It no longer participates in the emotional shaping of the moment. It simply holds space for reality to unfold without distortion. In relationships, this is where most people feel discomfort, not because silence is harmful, but because it removes control over the narrative. People cannot easily predict how they are being received. They cannot adjust tone in real time. They cannot rely on emotional confirmation to stabilize their internal state. And so they begin to reveal what they normally regulate. This is where intent becomes visible, not through confrontation, but through exposure. And exposure, unlike interrogation, requires no force. It only requires absence of interference. The Sophia Stage empath understands this deeply. They do not rush to fill silence. They do not rush to resolve it. They allow it to function. Because they recognize something most people miss. Clarity does not always come from more information. Sometimes it comes from less interference. And in that reduced interference, the real structure of a person's psychology begins to appear. Their patience, their insecurity, their control patterns, their emotional dependence, all of it becomes more visible not because it is amplified, but because it is no longer being hidden by constant interaction. This is why silence at this level is not withdrawal. It is observation without distortion. And once you can observe without distorting, you no longer need to chase truth through conversation. You let it surface on its own, and you recognize it before it ever becomes words. At a certain point in emotional development, the entire architecture of attachment begins to change. Not in a dramatic emotional break, but in a quiet restructuring of need itself. What used to feel like connection driven by urgency starts to feel like connection driven by choice. And that shift changes everything about how a person relates to others and to themselves. In the earlier stages, attachment style operates almost invisibly in the background. It dictates how quickly someone reaches for closeness, how intensely they fear distance, how they interpret inconsistency, and how they regulate emotional security through external validation. Whether it shows up as anxious pursuit or avoidant withdrawal, the underlying mechanism is the same: dependency on relational feedback to stabilize internal state. For an empath, this is often amplified. Because their sensitivity makes them highly responsive to relational shifts, attachment wounds become more active, not less. A slight change in tone can feel like abandonment. A delay in response can feel like rejection. Emotional inconsistency in another person doesn't just register, it lands deeply, often bypassing rational interpretation entirely. But in the Sophia stage, something fundamental gets rewritten. It is not that attachment disappears, it is that its authority collapses. The nervous system begins to learn a new form of stability that is not dependent on external reassurance. And this is where the concept of secure detachment emerges. Not detachment as avoidance and not security as dependency, but a fusion of both states into something more precise, the ability to remain emotionally open without becoming emotionally entangled. This is a subtle but radical shift, because now connection is no longer a survival strategy. It is an option. The empath no longer enters relationships to regulate internal uncertainty. They enter from a place of internal baseline stability, and when that happens, the entire power dynamic of attachment dissolves. Anxious patterns lose their urgency because there is no longer a need to chase emotional resolution. Avoidant patterns lose their necessity because there is no longer a threat in closeness. What remains is presence without compulsion, and this is where many people misinterpret the Sophia stage. They assume distance is being created, but in reality, dependency is being removed. The person is not becoming colder, they are becoming less governed by fear-based attachment programming. This creates a very specific psychological effect. Relationships no longer function as emotional regulators. They function as conscious choices. The empath is no longer using people to stabilize their inner world. And because of that, they are no longer vulnerable to emotional leverage in the same way. When someone no longer needs consistent reassurance, inconsistency loses its power. When someone is not dependent on validation, withdrawal loses its impact. When someone is not emotionally anchored to another person's behavior, manipulation loses its entry points. But perhaps the most important shift is internal. Because secure detachment does not reduce emotional capacity, it refines it. The empath can still feel deeply, still connect meaningfully, still engage fully, but they are no longer pulled out of themselves in the process. There is no collapse of identity inside the relationship. There is participation without absorption, and that changes the entire experience of love, conflict, and separation. In conflict, there is no longer panic-driven repair. There is observation and response without escalation. In separation, there is no psychological fragmentation. There is acceptance without internal collapse. In connection, there is depth without dependency. This is where emotional maturity becomes unmistakable. Not because the person feels less, but because they are no longer controlled by what they feel in relation to others. And in this state, something very important happens. The empath stops negotiating their worth through emotional proximity. They are no longer asking, consciously or unconsciously, will this person stay so I can feel stable? Instead, the question becomes, does this connection align with clarity, respect, and mutual awareness? That shift removes desperation from attachment entirely, and without desperation, manipulation has no emotional leverage. Because all manipulation depends on one core mechanism, the fear of losing emotional stability through relational loss. When that fear is no longer dominant, the structure collapses. What remains is choice. And choice, psychologically speaking, is the highest form of internal authority. It is the point where behavior is no longer reactive but intentional, no longer conditioned but conscious. At that level, relationships are no longer places where the self is maintained. They are spaces where the self is expressed without distortion. And once you reach that state, you realize something quietly powerful. You were never meant to hold on to connection through fear. You were meant to experience it without ever losing yourself inside it. At a certain point in psychological development, something subtle but irreversible happens. The need to announce presence disappears. Not because the person becomes smaller, quieter, or less expressive, but because they no longer rely on expression to establish impact. Most people misunderstand power because they associate it with volume. They think influence is tied to speech, persuasion, charisma, or emotional intensity, but in advanced psychological awareness, presence itself becomes the dominant signal. And presence does not need amplification. It does not compete. It does not chase attention. It simply is. In earlier stages of empathic development, there is often an unconscious pull toward over-explaining, over-giving, or emotionally adjusting in real time to maintain relational harmony. This creates a subtle dependency. The empath's internal state becomes partially shaped by how they are being received. Their energy fluctuates based on feedback. Their expression adapts based on perceived reaction. But in the Sophia stage, that entire feedback dependency begins to dissolve. What replaces it is stability without performance. And this is where presence becomes the real source of influence. Because when a person is no longer emotionally negotiating their place in an interaction, something shifts in the field around them. They stop transmitting uncertainty. They stop broadcasting need for validation. They stop adjusting themselves in subtle ways to maintain connection. And what remains is a steady psychological signal, calm, observant, unreactive awareness. This kind of presence is not loud. In fact, it is often quiet, but it is unmistakable. People feel it before they can define it. And the reason is simple. Most social environments are built on micro-adjustments. People constantly calibrate themselves based on what others are doing, tone matching, emotional mirroring, subtle compliance behaviors, unspoken bids for approval. It is a dynamic system of mutual regulation. But when someone stops participating in that regulation cycle, the system changes. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. Because now there is one element in the environment that is not being shaped by external input. One presence that is not reacting in predictable ways. One mind that is not emotionally syncing with the room. And this creates cognitive friction in others. Not discomfort in a dramatic sense, but awareness. A quiet recognition that not everything in the environment is responding in the usual way. That is where perceived power begins. Not in control, not in dominance, but in non-reactivity. Because non-reactivity removes predictability, and predictability is what most people rely on to feel socially safe. When someone cannot be easily influenced by emotional cues, when they do not escalate with tension or collapse under pressure, they become structurally difficult to position within normal social hierarchies. They are no longer easily moved. And this is why silence, observation, and emotional neutrality begin to converge at this stage. They all serve the same function, reducing unnecessary internal distortion so perception remains clean. From the outside, this can be misinterpreted as detachment, indifference, or emotional distance. But internally, it is none of those things. It is refined awareness without interference. The ability to stay fully present without being pulled into reaction loops. And this is where influence changes form. Because at this level, influence is no longer something that is done. It is something that emerges. People adjust themselves around stable presence automatically. They reveal more. They seek alignment. They test boundaries without realizing it. Not because they are being manipulated, but because human systems naturally respond to equilibrium points in their environment. A stable presence becomes a reference point, and reference points quietly organize behavior around them. This is the paradox. The less you attempt to control interaction, the more clearly others reveal how they orient themselves around you. And the less emotional distortion you introduce, the more accurately you perceive what is actually happening. So power in this sense is not an act. It is a byproduct of internal coherence. A person in Sophia Stage awareness does not need to assert influence. They do not need to escalate intensity. They do not need to dominate space. Their stability does the work for them. Their clarity does the communication. Their presence becomes the message without translation. And that is why it feels different to others. Not threatening, not aggressive, but unmistakably unmovable. Because at that level, you are no longer participating in emotional chaos as a participant. You are observing it as a fixed point within it. And anything that cannot be easily shifted begins to shape the system around it. That is the final shift. When presence itself becomes influence, and influence no longer requires effort, only consistency. And in that state, you realize something that changes your entire understanding of power. You were never meant to speak louder than the world. You were meant to stand so still that the world starts listening differently.